50 years ago this week, the Whitlam government was elected and, according to a piece in today's Australian newspaper, "We really changed the face of Australia," boasts one of the Whitlam ministers. I looked hard, assuming the newspaper had made a typo and forgotten to add the final three words, "for the worse." I was living overseas during the Whitlam years, so I don't have the same starry-eyed memories of many teenagers from that era, but I did return to Canberra in 1975 just in time to enjoy all the fun and games of the dismissal, and was astonished at how my lefty teachers and fellow students were wailing and carrying on like banshees as if someone had just shot one of the Beatles when Gough was sent packing from the steps of Parliament House. Whitlam was swiftly martyred and immortalised amongst the cool Canberra clique, but I could never quite see what all the fuss was about. It always struck me as simply a matter of a bloke who was useless at his job getting punted, as happens every day around the world, or used to. So, as an antidote to all the eulogising that is going on, no doubt, over at the ABC and elsewhere, I thought I should offer up my own top 10 reasons why Whitlam deserved what he got, and indeed help back up my contention that the Whitlam government and everything it did indeed change the face of Australia for the worse. I mentioned the ABC, so let's kick off with them. Here's how the ABC's program Behind the News, which is BTN, which is used as an educational tool, propaganda tool throughout all Australian schools. Here's how they sell the Whitlam legacy to impressionable young Aussie school kids.
This was Australia in the 1970s, a time when flowers and flares were fashion and society was changing quickly. It was also the time when this man, Edward Gough Whitlam, asked Australians to make him the leader of the country. In 1972, he was successful, and once in office, he started changing things.
Okay, so far so good. Feel the vibe, man, but let's get stuck into some specifics.
One of the things he thought was really important was education, so he scrapped uni fees. That meant that more Aussies could go on to higher education and be whatever they wanted to be.
Yes, be whatever they wanted to be. This is the moment the deterioration of our universities from globally respected centres of learning and expertise, free speech and debate came crashing to a dismal end. Gough's free uni education for all basically devalued the entire motivation to go to university, to work and study hard, and instead turned it into a kind of frivolous lefty holiday camp, or certainly turned the arts and humanities departments into the jokes that they now are. I should know I did one completely forgettable year at the ANU post-Whitlam before dropping out and deciding there was nothing of value I was being taught other than being daily urged to save the whale and keep uranium in the ground. Many Conservatives warned at the time that if you make things free, you deprive them of their true worth. And education is no different. Prior to Whitlam, scholarships were available to poorer kids, and although not perfect, the system did ensure those who went to university respected and worked hard to benefit from the education on offer. Of course, the so-called free university education was anything but. As John Roscombe from the IPA pointed out to me, all Whitlam did was to shift the cost of university onto the hard-working taxpayers and, more importantly, onto blue-collar workers and people, many of whom were never going to get the benefit of a tertiary education. The free education also removed any connection between the real world and universities, which has in turn created the disaster that universities are today. Whereas today's universities offer up a free smorgasbord of pointless humanities, gender, climate, you name it, courses that offer little in the way of genuine or productive employment. Free universities? I'd say Gough certainly changed tertiary education, but for the worse. And then came free healthcare for all.
Gough also wanted Aussies to have free medical care. So he came up with the free national healthcare system we now know as Medicare.
Again, there is obvious merit to Whitlam's original Medibank scheme, which morphed into Medicare. But we are now seeing the problems within a health system that simply can't cope with demand, and indeed, it is likely our own health system will crumble into the chronic decay now evident in Britain's NHS, which Whitlam's universal healthcare model was obviously based on. According to Professor David Flint, the system which preceded Medibank under the Menzies government was superior. Now, have a look at this.
Aboriginal land rights was another issue Gough tackled as PM. He was the first leader to hand back land to its original owners.
I solemnly hand to you these deeds as proof in Australian law that these lands belong to the Gurindji people.
Well, land rights was always going to be a very difficult issue for whichever governments, and of course today's Indigenous activists of the likes of Lydia Thorpe argue that all land is Indigenous land, that sovereignty was never ceded, and the logical conclusion is that Australia, as we know it, is an illegitimate nation. So it's safe to say that whatever lies ahead, be it treaties or co-governance or non-Indigenous Australians paying permanent rent to Indigenous Australians, all of this divisiveness began under Whitlam, for better and for worse. But arguably, where Whitlam was an absolute disaster, and this of course isn't mentioned anywhere by the ABC, is what I mentioned a couple of nights ago here on the show, and that was the Whitlam-Coombs fantasy that remote communities could economically flourish in both the ancient and the modern world, living in both together, which led to the corruption and quasi-communism of so many remote communities to this day.
He also ended Australia's involvement in the Vietnam War and brought an end to conscription, which is when people are forced to serve in the armed forces during times of war.
We will abolish conscription forthwith.
Well, I know many mums and sons were very happy that conscription ended in Australia. But again, you have to look at countries like Israel that do have a form of national service that teaches young kids many skills and sets them up for life. And how weak we are militarily today, and how so many kids seem to be trapped in a world of woke-fueled depression and anxiety. And it's tempting to ask, was conscription, or, well, at least some form of national service, really such a bad idea?
He also lowered the voting age from 21 to 18, scrapped knighthoods and other royal honours, got rid of the death penalty, created the Racial Discrimination Act, became the first PM to visit China, and he helped protect environmental sites.
Okay, well, there's a bit of a grab bag of Whitlam material there, worth unpacking. The voting age dropped from 21 to 18. Clearly, Labor felt this was to their advantage, which it was. The younger you are, the more idealistic, or gullible and naive might be a better way of phrasing it, and the less pragmatic you are, and the less interested in, budgets and economics and things like that. Which is why there is now a push to lower the voting even further, all the way down to 16. As for knighthoods, spare me. Today's lefties trip over themselves to get their hands on whatever gongs and baubles are going. The idea that knighthoods were elitist or an anachronism is laughable. So, the death penalty, well, I don't disagree with Gough on that one, so we'll give him that one. Then we get one of the very worst pieces of Whitlamism, the introduction of the Racial Discrimination Act. This pernicious piece of legislation opened the way for the United Nations to interfere in our legal system, and we have suffered ever since. All the problems we now have with trans ideology, gender activism, Indigenous activism at the extremes, cancel culture, the silencing of free speech, the endless victimhood culture of anti-discrimination and being discriminated against and being offended, all stems from Whitlam signing us up to the Racial Discrimination Act. China, well, what the ABC failed to mention, to quote David Flint, who nominated this as his #1 of Whitlam's worst actions, was, quote, propping up the largest mass murderer in history, Mao Zedong. Only in the last few years have Australians started to wake up to the threat that Chinese communism poses directly to us, not to mention the region, and it is long overdue. All of our appeasement and all of our kowtowing to China stems all the way back to Whitlam. Most unforgivable of all, under Whitlam, we abandoned Taiwan, and we disgracefully also recognised the communist invasion and enslavement of 3 Baltic states. Oh, and environmentalism. Well, don't even start me on that one. Indeed, when you think about it, the whole world of woke began with Whitlam. Whitlam, the granddaddy of woke.
Gough was the first world leader to appoint a women's affairs advisor, give single mums welfare payments, and he started radio station Triple J.
Gough had the first women's advisor, of course he did, and thus began women's quotas in political parties, myths and so on about the gender pay gap, the Me Too movement and all its Australian versions thereof, toxic masculinity, it all has its seeds under Whitlam. And single mums welfare, again, merit in the idea, but the result for many young girls has been to condemn them to a life on permanent welfare. And finally, well, Gough Whitlam started the music station Triple J. I rest my case. I asked a few notable conservatives and writers for The Spectator Australia to list their top 5 worst of Whitlam. You've probably got your own that you can name. David Flint mentioned those I've already covered. Judith Sloan nominated economic ignorance and naivety. Cairns, Cameron and Kemlani she threw into the mix, and, as she says as well, the beginning of wokeness. As well as free universities, John Roscombe nominated the 17% inflation under Whitlam, the Kemlani loans affair, that dodgy story, the ditching, and this is still with us today, the ditching of assimilation. A terrific policy which was replaced instead by the embrace of Whitlam and his cohorts with this multiculturalism. Kerry Wakefield also nominated the Kemlani affair, the massive overspending and blowing of the budget, and she pointed to us giving PNG independence before PNG was quite ready for it, rushed through under Whitlam, and in shades of ScoMo's censure, the 2-man government that Whitlam ran all by himself with Lance Bernard for some months. And finally, Neil Brown concurred with many of the above, plus Whitlam's total indifference, as he put it, as Neil Brown put it, Whitlam's total indifference to the increasing inflation rate, the increased interest rates, and the rising unemployment, all as a result of the policies he was responsible for. Did Gough Whitlam leave Australia better off or worse off? In my opinion, there is no question. On far too many fronts, he trashed what had successfully worked before and replaced it with socialist fantasies that we have laboured under ever since. In a nutshell, the culture wars began under Gough Whitlam, and the left have been torching our precious values and institutions ever since. Worse off? You bet we are.